In this tutorial, you'll learn how to bring out the potential of a raw image that looks like this and quickly turn it into a final image that looks like this by using a combination of Lightroom and luminosity masks. But first, I want to share an opportunity to get some incredible photography courses from top instructors at over 95% off. The 5-day deal bundle. There are dozens of amazing instructors involved, including Ryan Dyer, Mark Denny, Nigel Danson, Joshua Snow, Mads Peter Iverson, and far too many more to list. And if that weren't enough, both my Lumenzia panel for Photoshop as well as Nick Page's luminosity masking course featuring Lumenzia are both part of this year's bundle. Now, if you only wanted a few of the 54 products in the complete bundle, you'd already be saving a lot of money investing in your skills. And if you buy through my link below this video, I'll also give you a free copy of my new Norway from start to finish course. But don't delay, the sale on the 5-day bundle ends Tuesday. Every once in a while, the best part of sunset is actually long after the sun goes down. And as soon as I realized that this night was going to be one of those nights, I quickly rushed down the side of this hill and set up for a 2-minute exposure to get a nice soft set of clouds and pick up that gorgeous color. Now, there are a number of things I want to do to address this image and bring out what I saw from this raw, but it should be a pretty quick and easy process. The first thing I want to address is just the overall color because it really was very dramatic and doesn't quite look so here. And I'm going to begin by warming this thing up. Let's bring our temperature up to maybe around 7,500 and bring up our tint to maybe around like 13 or 15, somewhere in there to bring out more of that lovely color in the sky and help it expand further across the sky. Now, in doing so, the foreground here actually has picked up, I think, a little bit too much of the magenta color cast. And rather than backing off the tint, I'm simply going to go down to the camera calibration tab and use a slider. I don't use that often, but it can be really powerful. And that's this tint slider for the shadows. If we bring this down to about -15, see how the foreground now has much better coloration without losing any of that color in the sky. And while we're down here, let's go ahead and kick up the saturation on the blue to maybe 40 or so and the green to maybe 20 or so to just bring out more of that latent color in the image. So in doing this, we've, I think, nicely started to bring out some of that color, and let's work on the tones in the image. The exposure overall is pretty dark. You can see I underexposed. I took my best guess, but it was a rush situation. So I'm going to bring up the exposure here, maybe half a stop. Should give me enough to work with in these areas, especially if I go and boost the shadows a bit, maybe take them up around 30 or so. And let's take our blacks up around 10 or 15, something like this. Just bring out some latent detail, something we can work with when we want to go dodge and burn in Photoshop. We're just trying to get things started at this point. Now it also looks a bit flat, and I'm going to bring up the contrast a little bit as well to offset that, maybe around 15 or 20, something like this. And maybe even add a little clarity. I don't often add too much clarity, but maybe 10 points just to get things going. So overall, it has a little more crispness and a little bit more color going for it in the image at this point. I think I could add even a little bit more color, and what I'm going to do now is go down to color grading, where we can add a little bit of warmth to the highlights and perhaps some offsetting coolness in the shadows. So for the highlights, let's just take this and drag the highlights towards around the 30-40 hue mark. Maybe I'll just take it up to the top here so we can see it, maybe around here, and then just holding shift, bring it down to saturation around here. So kind of 30-30 in the highlights. The shadows, I usually go for something around 225, 235. Let's just go with 235 and then back it way off to only a few points, maybe like 5 or so points of saturation for the shadows there. Even that's maybe a little more than I want. I'll just back it off to like 4 or so. So I think that overall is a good start for my image. A couple of technical things in this image. I've got something in the sky here I want to clone out, so let's zoom into that. And it looks like there's some kind of a plane or something moving through the scene here. So we'll just go and remove it from the sky. Easier to do it in the raw when you can. It's very easy to do on the sky. So we can just remove that, clean that up. Zooming back, a couple other issues. There's a bit of an artificial light, which I'll remove in Photoshop. That's gonna be too hard to do in raw. And then overall, I'd like to slant this horizon, make it a little more level. So I'm gonna hit R for my crop tool and just click and drag to something like this to make this horizon look more level. So I think that's looking like a really good starting point for us to go over to Photoshop. For the sake of comparison, let's create a duplicate that shows the original raw. So I'm going to simply create a virtual copy of this. In my virtual copy, let's just reset everything back to the original settings with a right click there. But I'm going to go back and just copy the rotation so that when we compare before and after, we don't have to worry about that rotation. So now they're aligned, and I'm going to shift click to select both versions of the image, right click, go edit in, and open as layers in Photoshop. Now here in Photoshop, we have both our original raw and then our adjusted version. Let's just rename the bottom one. We'll simply call it original so we can remember that this is just here as a reference, and I'll hide it, and we'll just be working from our process version. Now what I need to do with this image is mostly dodging and burning to bring out more of the detail in the foreground as well as color and just the beauty of the sky. So to kick that off, let's go click on Dodge for a new Dodge Burn layer from Lumenzia. Transparent should work great, as well as the overlay blend mode. Click on Dodge Burn, and we're ready now to start painting to lighten areas we want to light. So I'm going to paint on these foreground ridges. In order to hit the highlights and not the shadows though, I want a luminosity selection to help guide my work. So I'm going to go click on L in Lumenzia for a preview of a light selection. Looks like the default lights 1.5 is great. So I'm going to click on Cell to load that as a selection. But first, take note that this part of the image is almost not selected at all. So I'm not going to be able to dodge in, bring out shadow detail from the mountain here. I'll need a different selection later for that. But this does work great for this part of the image as well as for the sky. I'm going to need something different in this part of the image, but we'll get back to that in a moment. First, let's click on Cell to make it our active selection. Hitting B for our brush. I've already got white paint loaded in the foreground using high opacity and low flow. Just start brushing in these highlight areas. And what I'm trying to do is hit more the highlight side than the shadow side, but my luminosity selection is making that almost impossible not to do. As I go through here, I'm just kind of resizing my brush a little bit to complement the size of whatever I'm painting in that part of the image, bringing out key details and just trying to make it look like the light is wrapping around the top of these mountains, coming off the sky, and bringing out the best of this foreground area. And I did say this part of the image isn't getting a lot of light, but it's getting some. So I'm going to dodge and burn that area just to bring out what I can while I'm here. And then I think that's looking pretty good for this foreground. Let's just kind of quickly look from before to after. See how much we've already brought out the detail in these areas. Looks really nice. I'm going to add just a little bit more in a few areas I'd like to give some texture to, but I think we've already got a nice looking adjustment for this part of the scene here. So we'll stick with that. I do want to note though that the color is a little bit muted. I wouldn't mind having a bit of warmth to it. So as I move more to this part of the image, which is even more blue, I'm going to add a little bit of warmth to my color. But before I get rid of the selection I have now, let's work on the sky because the same selection is going to work great up here. I don't want to paint with white because that will lose some of the color I have in the sky. Instead, let's hit I for the eyedropper, sample from the existing sky, and then we can use the color that it has to make things even better. I'm going to take my brightness up to the max. Saturation, maybe 30, 35 is great. The hue is maybe a little bit more magenta. I'm going to bring it all the way up to the top so it's closer to a warmer color here. I could even bring it down in lower values, but I think this will be great. I'm trying to stick to something in the zone of what I sampled from the sky. Clicking OK, hitting B for my brush, making it a little bit bigger. I'm just going to go and brush through here these areas of color that I want to enhance. And you see how that just really makes that sky look just awesome as it comes through there. And it does wrap a little bit to the foreground. So let's go ahead and paint that tiny bit, bringing through some of that color. And just look before and after how much we've already improved this image with that quick little set of adjustments there. Now let's start working on this area here. And I really don't need a different dodge burn layer. I just need a different selection. So set Command D to deselect, and you see the cell button is no longer green, so we know we don't have an active selection. And I want something that's going to help me pick up the darks. So if I click on D, I get a preview of darks. I don't want to be painting over into the sky if we've got that nice color I created, so let's go bring it down to something more like darks 3. Now there's some good separation between the two. Could even push it down to like 3 1/4 or 3 1/2. Somewhere in there, something like that is great. And I want to load that as a selection. But I don't want to paint the blackest parts of the foreground as much as I want to paint the highlights in these shadows. So this selection is not yet complete. What I'm going to do is load this as a selection, but then I want to subtract out the blacks from it. If I just double click the minus button in Lumenzia, it will automatically create and subtract something that's 2 levels darker. So I'm subtracting darks 5.5 from the darks 3.5 that I had. So I say okay, and now I'm ready to start brushing in these areas. Hitting B for my brush, and I'm going to switch my paint away from this sky color, this pink, over to something that's going to warm it up. So let's go take our hue and bring it up closer to like 40 or so. I think the hue can come down to the saturation come down to like 20%. I don't want to add a ton of color, just a little bit of warmth to these areas. So we'll say okay, hitting B for my brush, and just sizing appropriately for this area. Start brushing in, and in these background mountains here, using a little bit smaller brush, and then in the foreground, because it's so dark, I'll make multiple passes to kind of help lighten this area and bring out some of that shadow detail. But you can see how it's really starting to show much more what's going on there. And then pass through this foreground and try and lighten up these areas, really give a sense of the veining on these Badlands and just how gorgeous and rich in depth they are and deep they are. As you're standing here, you really feel like you're in front of this just amazing three-dimensional landscape, and the dodging and burning is going to help us bring out that depth. It's something I spent a lot of time in my dodging and burning master course to go through, but you're getting a quick sense here of just how much depth you can create with one single dodge and burn layer to really light the scene there. And that's looking, I think, really nice. So let's deselect that and just kind of keep pushing things. This natural color looks good, but I'd like to add even a little bit more warmth to it. And if I go to selective color, this is a nice way to go pick color by color. I'm just going to zoom back so we can see the whole sky, but I can work on just the red colors here. And if I remove cyan, I'm effectively adding red. So we'll maybe go to something like -60 on the cyans. And then it's getting a little bit too magenta as I do that. So subtract out some of the magentas to like maybe -35 or so. And just going full screen here, just look from before and after that selective color adjustment, how it's nicely bringing out some more color in the sky here and giving us more of a transition from a warm color to a red to a cool blue, and just giving that sky a little bit more sense of depth. To take things even further, I'd like to dodge in a little bit more light color in the sky here, and we can do that by just clicking for a solid fill adjustment and picking a color of our choice. I'm going to go take a nice warm hue around 40 is usually what I like. Take our saturation down, but still doing something pretty heavy here. I'm thinking something like 40 even. We'll push it pretty far. If it's not right, I can adjust it. And taking that brightness up to the max, click OK. This is the light we're going to be painting in. I'm going to Alt click on mask to give myself a black mask. So it's starting hidden and I just need to reveal it in these sky areas. But once again, I want to paint on things that are lighter. So I need a lights preview from Lumenzia. Lights 1.5 again looks great. So I'm going to load that by clicking on cell to make that my active selection. Then just using B for my brush, make it a little bit bigger, paint near these horizon areas where I should have more of that warm yellow glow, letting some of it spill into the foreground highlights there. If it can, I don't know that that selection is quite going to do that, but to the extent that it can, let's bring that through and just look before and after how that nicely kind of warms up the sky. I'm going to go and just reverse my brush to black with the X key there and just maybe knock off a little bit in the edges, tighten that up a little bit more just down to those areas there. And just one last pass there. I just like having it more warm on the horizon. So I think that that is looking really nice. At this point, I want to go focus on this light pollution. If we zoom in here, there's some kind of artificial light in the background I'd like to get rid of. I don't have another exposure because I was working really quickly and cloning would be a lot of time. So my goal here is just to diminish this rather than necessarily eliminating it. And because it's very yellow, I could go and create a new HSL adjustment. So I'm going to hit Command D to deselect, I have no active selection. Go click on HSL, and within HSL, I can go switch over to the yellows. And all I want to do is just bring down the saturation, maybe -60 or so. And let's bring down the lightness. So we're just going to knock off that light around -60 there. See how that darkens things down quite a bit. A little bit of glow in that mountain that I wouldn't mind knocking back. So if I bring out the red to the edge, it's not quite going to get that. So let's leave that back in there, but maybe just kind of expand that feathered zone on the edge a little bit there. Something like that. And now I don't want to decolor my foreground. I just want to use it in this part of the image. So what I can do is, once again, Alt click on mask, gives me a black mask, and I can start painting on these areas. I'd like to use the luminosity selection to help, and this is kind of a mid-tone, so let's try something like Zone C, which we can see is preferential to the brightest parts of the scene there. So that works great. It's not totally cutting off these other areas, so we'll have to brush with a little bit of care, but it should be very helpful. So click on cell to load that. Hitting B for my brush, switching to white as my foreground color, and just shrinking this down a bit. Just go and brush over these areas, maybe brush down a little bit more, and just kind of knocking this back a bit here until it just minimizes things. Like I said, it's not going to go away, but if we zoom back and look at the overall image from before, where it's really pulling your eye to the left, to after, where it's subtle enough that you really wouldn't pay attention to it, I think that looks much better. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect, and lastly, let's go and click L for a lasso selection so we can create a vignette. I'm going to go select this part of the scene where I want to create a vignette. Then going up to vignette, I'm going to hold the Shift key when I click it, which will not only give me a vignette, but also a protected blend if. So I'm not going to punish the shadows on the outside areas. I'm going to preserve shadow detail in the vignetted region so that things still look really nice, but we're bringing attention into the middle of the scene where it belongs. And let's just now compare. If we turn on our original, if we alt click it, we can see here's our original raw, which is looking really flat. We've got, our defects in the sky, defects in the background. All these badlands look really flat. They're losing color. The sky doesn't have a lot of color. To after, where we have a much more beautiful scene with a lot more detail. Now click into this next video to learn more about how to master the selective color tool in Photoshop.